Good afternoon, early afternoon here, around 1 o'clock. We are presently in Jonsered, a bit outside Gothenburg. East, 25 kilometers. And it's a lovely day. There was a heavy rainfall all of yesterday. Grey, dark skies. But today it was a complete change. We went from the dark sky to the sunny light sky today, and I think we're approaching degrees of 13, 14, something in that vicinity. I will continue the text by Jacques Derrida, an apocalyptic tone recently adopted in philosophy. And we are currently at page 28. Third paragraph, beginning with but I think of another ply or plea, which we are also in the daylight of today. Everything that can now inspire a demystifying desire regarding the apocalyptic tone, namely a desire for light, for lucid vigilance, for the elucidating vigil, for truth. All that is already found on the way, and I shall say in apocalyptic transference, it is already a citation or recitation of John, or of what already programmed John's dispatches in one, when, for example, he writes for a messenger under the dictate of the great voice come from behind his back, and which tenders itself like a shofar, like a ram's horn. Here we have a Bible site. To the messenger of the community in Ephesus, write, he says this: he who seizes the 7 stars in his right hand, he who walks in the midst of the 7 lamps of gold. I know your works, your toil, your endurance. You cannot endure the wicked. You have tested those who call themselves envoys and are not, and you find them liars. But I have this against you: your first love, you have left it. And the dispatches multiply. Then the 7 messengers come up to the 7th, after which the temple of Elohim is open to the sky. The coffer of his pact appears in his temple. There come lightning flashes, voices, thunders, an earthquake, great hail. A great sign appears in the sky. A woman clothed in the sun. The moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. So we, Aufklärer of modern times, we continue to denounce the impostor apostles, the so-called envois or envoys, who are not sent by anyone. The liars and unfaithful ones, the turgidness and the pomposity of all those charged with a historic mission, of whom nobody has requested anything and whom nobody has charged with anything. Shall we thus continue in the best apocalyptic tradition to denounce false apocalypses? The habit plea being taken up, I am not going to multiply the examples. The end approaches, but the apocalypse is long-lived. The question remains and comes back. What can be the limits of a demystification? No doubt one can think, I do, that this demystification must be led as far as possible. And the task is not modest. It is interminable, because no one can exhaust the over-determinations and the indeterminations of the apocalyptic stratagems. And above all, because the ethical political motive or motivation of these stratagems is never reducible to some simple. I recall thus that their rhetoric, for example, is not only destined to mislead the people, rather than the powerful in order to arrive at retrograde, backward-looking, conservative ends. Nothing is less conservative than the apocalyptic genre. And as it is an apocalyptic, apocryphal, masked, coded genre, it can use the detour in order to mislead another vigilance, that of censorship. We know that apocalyptic writings increased the moment state censorship was very strong in the Roman Empire. And precisely to catch the censorship unawares. Now, this possibility can be extended to all censorships, and not only to the political and in politics to the official. Even if we remain with political censorship and were alert enough to know that it is not only practiced starting from specialized stateless officines, but everywhere like a thousand-eyed Argus in a majority, in an opposition, in virtual majority, with respect to everything that does not let itself be centered by the logic of the current political discourse and of the conceptual oppositions legitimated by the contract between the legitimate adversaries. Well, then we would perhaps think that the apocalyptic discourse can also get round censorship thanks to its genre and its cryptic ruses. But its very tone, the mixing of voices, genres, codes, apocalyptic discourse can also, in dislocating destinations, dismantle the dominant contract or concordat. Concordat is important, we mentioned that before. You can see the unison of the polytonal disturbances as the concordat. Dismantle the dominant contract or concordat. It is a challenge to the established receivability of messages and to the policing of destination. In short, the postal police or the monopoly of posts. Conversely, we could even say that every discord or every tonal disorder, everything that detones and becomes inadmissible in general collocution, everything that is no longer identifiable starting from the established codes. From both sides of a front will necessarily pass for mystagogic, obscurantistic and apocalyptic. It will be made to pass for such. If we now inquire about another limit of demystification, a limit perhaps more essential and which would perhaps distinguish a deconstruction from a simple progressive demystification in the style of the Enlightenment. I would be tempted by another bearing. For finally, to demystify the seductive or agogic maneuver is fine and necessary. But must we not first ask ourselves, with a view to what end does it seduce, use trickery, mislead, maneuver? About this other bearing, I am going to say a very quick word in order to conclude and try to respond, if possible, to a request. Several times I have been asked why I had taken on an apocalyptic tone and put forward apocalyptic themes. That is how they have often been qualified. Sometimes with suspicion, and above all, I have noticed in the United States, where people are always more sensitive to phenomena of prophetism, messianism, eschatology and apocalypse here now, that I have multiplied the distinctions between closure and end, that I was aware of speaking of discourses on the end rather than announcing the end. Very important, that I have multiplied the distinctions between closure and end, that I was aware of speaking on discourses on the end rather than announcing the end. That I intended to analyze a genre rather than practice it. Should be absolutely clear. and even when I would practice it, to do so with this ironic genre, clause wherein I try to show that this clause never belonged to the genre itself. Nevertheless, for the reasons I gave a few minutes ago, all language on apocalypse is also apocalyptic and cannot be excluded from its object. Then I also ask myself, why? To what ends? With a view to what? The apocalypse itself. I mean the historic writings thus named, and first the one side by John of Patmos. Had little by little settled in, above all, for the last 6 or 7 years, as a theme, a concern, a fascination, an explicit reference, and the horizon for me of a work or a task, although I know these rich and secret texts were badly. And here is this the take that they were secret. Remember the veiling and a secret within a secret, a Geheimnis, as Kant calls it. It is in this context very pertinent. This was first the case in Gla, whose columns are constantly shaken by apocalyptic shocks or laughs on the subject of apocalypse, and which in a certain moment mixes the remains of genres and of John. The John of the Gospel of the Apocalypse. And of Genet. We see there the Gospel and the Apocalypse violently severed, fragmented, redistributed, with blanks, shifts of accents, lines skipped or moved out of place. As if they reached us over a broken down teletype, a wiretap in an overloaded telephone exchange. And the long sequence jumbling the citations comes to an end thus. I would recommend see the overloaded telephone exchange or the broken teletype as the slack string, the determined string that doesn't give a resounding tone. And I, John, I have heard and seen all this, as his name indicates, the apocalyptic, in other words, capital unveiling, in truth lays bare the hunger for of self. Funeral rites. You recall on the same page, John was taken away from me. Jean needed a compensation, and the revelation of my friendship for Jean or Jean, I was hungry for Jean. It is called a colossal compensation. The absolute phantasm as absolute self-having, absolute knowledge in its most mournful glory, to swallow oneself in order to be close by oneself, to make oneself a mouthful, to become, in a word, bonder, bind, one's own proper bit. This savoir absolu, or savoir absolu, sounding the same, is very important. The apocalyptic tone is also the total knowledge, when with the thing invented, called thinking often, means that you have omniscience into everything. An absolute understanding, self-having, and it's a phantasm, of course. And you swallow yourself, or oneself, as it says in the text here. I like this swell self-swallowing. Self-having, swell self-swallowing. It doesn't have that healthy ring to it, to say the least. It puts limitations where there should be openness. It makes whatever exists to become less, not as telling, not as truthful. It's the other side, or the enlargement of the detoned voice. By its very detonalization can make itself understood. That was finally, as I said a few minutes ago, the case with La Carte Postale, where the allusions increase to the apocalypse and to its arithmosophy, where everything speculates on the figures and notably 7. The written 7, the angels, my angel, messengers and postmen, postman prediction, the announcement of the news, the holocaustic burning, and all the phenomena of Verstimmung, of change of tone, of mixing genres, of destinerance. If I can say that, or of clandestination or clandestination, so many signs are more or less bastard apocalyptic filiation. But it was not this thematic or tonal network that I wanted. In concluding, to stress. For want of time, I shall limit myself to the word, if it is a word, and to the motif, come, we heard that before, that occupies other text written in the meantime, in particular Pas, living on, and en ce moment même dans ce ouvrage me voici. 3 texts dedicated, we can say, to Blanchot and to Derrida. I was not immediately aware of the citational resonance of this come, or at least that its citation was also a reference to John's Apocalypse. I was not thinking of this when I wrote Pas, but I did not know it at the time of the other 2 texts. And I noted it. Come. This appeal resounds in the heart of the vision, in the I see. Following Christ's dictation, when it is said, I see in the right hand of him who is sitting on the throne. A volume written on the inside and out, sealed with seals, 7. I see a messenger strong. He cries in a great voice. Who is worthy to open the volume and break the seals? No one can, in heaven, on earth, or under the earth, open the volume or look at it. So we have come again. Come is showing the openness of what is to be. Come with me, or go with me, or go to what will become. And that's why earlier on we have the angels, messengers as it says, and postmen, deliverers of messages and prophecies. Prediction, the announcement of the seal, the holocaustic burning and the phenomena of Verstimmung, of change of tone, of mixing genres, of destinarals. I go to the Livingston text.
Here below we have a few lambs. The word lamb occurs 29 times in the book of Revelation. Here we have at least 5 lambs. I've never seen them there. Do you see, Hans? The lambs, never seen them before.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. So I will continue where we left off, and we learned that Wittgenstein was inspired by Reuben, but he took it even further. As we mentioned earlier, temporality has an important post to play. And time comes into the business with Brouwer. What remains, nevertheless, of Brouwer's idea of a constitutive dependence of mathematics on time, and does certainly influence Wittgenstein's remarks here, is the idea of the form of the facts as conditioned by the form of possible understanding of them, and this form itself as being irreducibly temporal. The point is that we cannot conceive of these facts as given from wholly outside time, or presented as such to a being that exists outside of it, except through a form which is itself in the relevant sense temporal, that of a calculative procedure. Rather, the necessity of conceiving the temporal facts from a position within time marks the form of these facts themselves. In such a way that it is not even so much as coherent to suppose that they could be conceived or perceived from beyond any such position. if we were then to draw out the temporal analogue to Wittgenstein's remark in RFM about the expansion of pi, we might indeed be tempted to say something like, even God can perceive and understand the facts about things happening in time only on the basis of an activity that is itself temporal. That is, itself within the time it perceives and understands. To say this would not to be to deny the very possibility of something like a view on the whole of time. A view, as it were, of the world sub specie aeternitas. But it would be to deny that such a view can be taken otherwise than from a position that is essentially located within time, and to affirm that this necessity marks the very form of the givenness and availability of entities and phenomena themselves. To put the position this way would be to adumbrate one of the several ways in which a constitutive reflection on finitude and the infinite, including especially their forms in relation to mathematical truths and results, sheds light on the necessary form of the phenomena and experiences of the world itself, and indeed as they are in themselves. What would be then the consequence of such a view, if maintained generally, for our understanding of the time of the world itself? And this is a question we ask so many times. Sein und Zeit. Zeit is always ignored. And therefore, Zeit will block out Sein. Temporality is a seldom understood aspect of reality. Therefore, logocentrism, I would say. In arguing against the possibility and tenability of the view of mathematical entities as simply atemporal. Listen now, we have discussed many times earlier in Brewer that we accuse them of making the things Platonic or non-spatial, non-existent. Here we also address the very important problem of making the mathematical entities atemporal, which is incredibly important. Missing out on this will also stop the understanding of the Platonic mathematics, or the Platonic God for that matter. And independent of the temporality and dynamism involved in the technique, Wittgenstein also suggests the emptiness of any idea of the world and its phenomena as surrounded by or surveyable from a position that is itself wholly extratemporal. Such a position is the one that is envisioned as occupied on the traditional Platonist conception by the mathematical entities itself, and the idea of a divine intellect capable of knowing them in their infinite totality without temporal calculation or procedure then supplies the necessary, if falsifying, correlative position of possible knowledge. What if the picture of mathematical truth and entities that situates them in such a position is shown on the basis of a constitutive consideration of the temporality of mathematical technique to be untenable, then it's doubtful whether any significant support remains for the idea of an extratemporal realm of determinate existence at all. I'm going to put a little pause here and fill up the whiteboard. Could you pause here? So we have a few gems from the Derrida text here, page 30. To dismantle the dominant contract of concordat. To do that, it means something has to come. It's a destination. A destination is a spatial thing, but see also the temporal aspect, so easily forgotten. It takes time. And later in the same text, that I have multiplied the distinctions between closure and end. Both take time. That I was aware of speaking of discourses on the end, rather than announcing the end. It's very pertinent. For there to be a coming and a going, and for there to be an end, temporality needs to be in effect, so to speak. Temporality itself cannot be determined for that to be possible. In the determined state, nothing is really possible. It's living in a static, non-happening state. The apocalypse in that sense is a positive thing because it speaks of temporality itself, the bringing in of change. This is the idea of the teletype that's broken down, or an overloaded telephone exchange. The postal service will not deliver the message. If time is not there, there can be no prophecy, no delivery of a love message. No good news, nor bad news. And that is in itself really bad news. That is given up, as we see in the rephrasal of Jacques Derrida, second paragraph on page 31. The absolute phantasm as absolute self-having, savoir absolu, or savoir absolu, in the other spelling, absolute knowledge. In its most mournful glory, to swallow oneself in order to be close by oneself, to make oneself a mouthful, to become, bind, bend, blindfold, get a hard-on, bandy, on its own proper bit. And I would like to see that as the complete stop of everything. The blind eye looking at itself in a mirror, taking everything in non-spatially, atemporally. Absolute savoir, savoir absolu. This message, however, is a positive one, and that is of the possibility of temporality, which also brings in spatiality. The possibility of space. And this is a development in what we have done earlier in the lectures. We'll be speaking about the non-spatial, especially in connection with Brewer and Bishop. That objects that are never made or thought of can still exist, and thought that to be something to deconstruct. Now we go to questioning the non-temporal, which is a tougher nut to crack. But it is only when time comes in that space reveals itself. Space is actually the secret, the Geheimnis. And a temporal understanding, or letting be of the temporal, opens the veil. And this is questioned and ironized and ridiculed by To Come by Jacques Derrida. To come. It's both a proposition and a sarcasm at the same time, just as time always is contradictory. It's in the very nature of time to be contradictory. A time that is not contradictory is not time. A temporal is a real delivery of message. So in this depiction is God, until this text, used to be outside time and space. God, because of our preposterous idea of savoir absolu, or absolute phantasm, we, like Newton and Descartes, place God outside of time and space. And we think in our preposterous, almost megalomaniac idea that we can give God a certain gift of thinking instead of being real. Castrated. We castrate God and gives him only thinking capacity, not the real capacities of time and space, and thereby nullifying God, placing him outside of any possibility of delivering a message or doing anything. And That fits excellently with the God of Newton, of deistic, who didn't do anything but a very few things in the world. According to Newton, fixing, for instance, the circular movement of Merkur, nothing else. And I would say this is the modern time God as well. It is not participatory. It is blocked or by megalomania or preposterous savoir absolu to enter into the world. We tell God what he can do. And he can only do a small thing we call thinking, with no power at all. The apocalyptic tone is a positive tone because it brings the possibility of temporality once more. And nothing could be worse than the atemporal, non-spatial take. The only thing you have in the end is the preposterous megalomania of thinking that you have omniscience and the almost sacrilegious idea that you can tell God what he's able to do, only to think. It's like telling a dog it will not be able to walk, look around, enjoy himself, finding things, doing things, helping. It can only sit in the corner and think, whatever that would mean if he doesn't do anything. It's another point from Wittgenstein and also Heidegger. Thinking without doing is nothing. It's neither thinking nor doing. It's a sheer impossibility of either the spiritual nor the doing in the world. Put something in my mouth so only coffee. So just that the message can be delivered is positive enough. In the stalemate, the blind eye, in the temporal, non-spatial, no delivery can be made. It's a standstill. It's pure friction. This is a quite positive and enlarging of former deconstruction of the Platonist conception of mathematics and the world. By bringing time in, we all of a sudden see all the possibilities, and we also discover or reveal our tendency to take, and also ourselves in our preposterous idea, take a non-temporal view of reality. I understand the whole of reality, but it will not take me any time at all. Not a time of learning, no time of relations, of being, doing, sharing, understanding. Listen to the word understanding, it's in gerund, it takes time. Instead, it becomes this very, very narrow slot. A narrow slot that is exactly like Zenon's paradox, where time itself cannot exist and no change is possible. How many philosophers of Greek tradition did not share that idea? Not only Parmenides, but also Anaximander, Xenophanes. The atemporality is the key to this understanding. And it's the missing clue, I would say, to open up the possibility of receiving the message, hearing the tune. Because otherwise, the apocalyptic positive message, or negative, becomes atonal and simply denotes, like static, unmoving things, like the stone logic of Edward de Bono, non-moving, malformed for understanding. They do not yield, they do not flex, they do not bend. And here on page 17, this will also, oddly enough, make it possible, going into the atemporal, understanding how time works. It will be possible, as we said earlier, to have the whole of time without explanation. We can view eternity. And I think that's the biggest surprise of them all. Eternity will open up itself once we allow things to become temporal. Whereas in the thinking status there is no chance of eternity. Understanding it, neither. So oddly enough, this possibility is thereby opened up to us. We will be able to understand at sometimes a part of eternity. And we can understand that we are ourselves eternal, divine if you like, made in the image of God, to be added here. We can only become eternal once we become temporal. Then we're participating in what is real. Maybe a comment from my dear colleague here, Kalle.
So here on page 31, in Derrida's paper, we have a quotation from Revelation chapter 5. He that is the messenger or angel, he cries in a great voice, "Who is worthy to open the volume and break its seals?" And I noticed that Derrida prints with a larger font, "Who is worthy." So how could you, and before that we state that it's with a great voice, so how can you say who is worthy and with a different voice? It's not really possible. So he writes cleverly, I think, for the first time. Would you agree that the font is slightly bigger?
It's larger, yeah. It's
Yes.
larger.
So how can you say who is worthy? You ask that a question to somebody. And then how can you possibly neutralize that voice? You don't. Because the idea in science is that the more neutral you are, the more scientific you are.
Yeah.
But that is stasis, as you said. It's like stagnated water. It's not science. And another thing I would like to comment is a question to you, Hans, on page 32 in Derrida's paper. This is a very difficult passage, so I excuse. So I read, "The voices, the places, the roots of come, traverse the partition of a song. A poem, a book of citational recital echoes as if it began corresponding. And in this traversal of this transference, the voices find their spacing the space of the movement, but they nullify it with the one stroke. They no longer give it time. That is, they no longer give it time. So, in other words, my paraphrases. So they are all these heavenly beings that sing come, 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 come. So there is really no time in one way. Because they go into each other, I think, the voices. Therefore, time in one way is nullified because of the echo, or because of the different tones of voice. But I don't know if that's the right interpretation of this phrase. They no longer give it time. I could read again the last long phrase. And in this traversal, what is transference? The voices find their spacing, and the space of their movement, but they nullify it with one stroke. They no longer give it time. They no longer give it time.
Okay, no, it's a tough one, this one. There is a kind of general narrator here, there. At the moment of the signature, he will call himself a witness, martyr, testimonial. My possible take of this, being very uncertain, is the witness is the one that makes the time to be nullified. Once you're passive, looking at something, not interacting, in a way time stops, slows down. He sees it as it is and do nothing. But this was a tough one. Sorry, Kalle, I can't give it more precise meaning here.
But okay, I think perhaps I got an idea.
Yeah, please do.
Um,
You managed to find the toughest text.
Now, today and yesterday I have been reading this article about the chicken or the egg problem.
Yes.
And before you look at something that is at the chicken or the egg, they are in different states. So they are only when you look at it, it becomes a chicken or the egg. So the time comes only when you look at it. So here is perhaps a kind of superposition. Could be. And you gave a good, what you call good clue when you mentioned the word witness. Because before you have a witness that is an observer, you cannot have time.
Oh.
I could read this again, see if this fits with this. And in this traversal of all this transference, the voices find their spacing, the space of the movement, but they nullify it with the one stroke. They no longer give it time. there is a kind of general narrator there. At the moment of the signature, he will call himself the witness. There is the angelic messenger there whose dispatch he reports. There is John there who begins to speak again, says that at present he is prostrating himself before the messenger who speaks to him. He tells me, do not seal the words of the inspiration of this volume. Yes, the time is near. I think we should digest this material.
Yes,
perhaps illumination comes later.
Yeah, most definitely. It was a wonderful question. Tough nut to crack. But you see, the text of Derrida opens up a lot of thinking. And you made my whiteboard fall.
I didn't touch it.
No, I know. It magically fell. No, but click the pause maybe.
Yes, pause.
Text. Welcome again after the summary and this great thinking. I will continue a bit with Livingston's text, Wittgenstein, Mathematics and Temporality. And it's something going into temporality that sort of changes everything. And it's something that we, I think, usually are not aware of or trying to deny. That understanding itself takes time because it sort of makes it impossible for us, we think, for us to have a conception of the world. Because it will be a delay. If I see something, then I have to understand it. It would delay the whole thing. That would be not something that we usually like. We want understanding to be immediate. Perception should always be immediate in our normal ideas. And thinking is without a time. And one of the reasons is that the conception that if understanding is temporal, we get locked in small temporal things and we cannot see the whole. And we cannot have objectivity if we're not in some way omniscient, understanding the whole world. But as Livingston and Wittgenstein showed earlier, objectivity will still be there. That we saw on page 13. So even if mathematics is situated in this rugged and fractal, complex context of human forms of life, and in the other, nevertheless, it will be fully determinate and objective with scarecrows. So it can be situated, it can have the Heidegger Befindlichkeit. This is a trait that also Heidegger shares. To be at home, to be a farmer, be situated at a time does not defy for understanding. It does not block it out. There seems to be a sort of logic running abode here and stopping us. Of course, it's, as Kalle said earlier, the detoned voice, the lure or the seduction of the detoned voice, with its detoned and empty promise of omniscience, a total understanding, that savoir absolu, taking in everything. or as somebody I know who said, I would like to have cameras all over the world so I can understand all that is happening. It was a rather ludicrous proposal, but I think it points into that direction of absolute understanding. Both Derrida and Wittgenstein is pointing to that is blocking of understanding, oddly enough. It's putting a deaf ear to the gospel of truth. Not hearing anymore, not taking in. Temporality in itself is what opens up for general and universal understanding. Compare that to Heraclitean plurality that doesn't exclude singularity and vice versa. So tough nut to crack. But the one with time is even harder. But even though, and even so, even the more important. Because we block out God from our view, as we block out our soul. Continue on page 17, a bit further down on the second paragraph, beginning with sins. Since this idea has, in fact, drawn much of its historical support, both in the philosophy of Plato himself and in subsequent developments of the theme. From the putative timelessness of mathematical entities. Once this support is removed, it is not clear whether the overall conception of temporality that it itself involves can remain in place. What is pointed to here is the Cartesian XYZ plus an extra dimension of time, outside of time, so to speak. At any rate, since it's not clear any longer that mathematics requires or even encourages us to postulate or invoke any kind of timeless realm outside, existence outside the temporal world, it seems that any considerations that still incline us to do so must be seen to arise from very different and distinctly non-mathematical sources. It's an open question at the very last sentence in Livingston's article. But it's a good suggestion that the need for lack of temporality is coming from somewhere outside. Our unwillingness to give up the feature of omniscience that we have given to ourselves as a medal. Maybe. we feel degraded if we lose it. Nothing of the sort is true, though. I will continue with Derrida's text here and parallel read what I just read. Because it's obvious time plays a great role also in Derrida. The main theme of Derrida is often called logocentrism, or the metaphysics of now. And he has looked deeply into that open question of Livingston, that there is something outside of mathematics that drags us into that direction. This is a bit further down on page 32. He tells me, do not seal the words of inspiration of this volume. Yes, the time is near. Double bind of an order John could only disobey in order to obey. Then Jesus speaks again. Naturally, in this directly reported mode that Plato called mimetic or apocryphal, and the play of quotation marks in the translation poses all the problems you can imagine. Each time we know that so-and-so speaks because he introduces himself. I, so-and-so. But he does this in the text written by the witness or the general narrator, who is always a party to it. Here it is, and it is the end. I, Yeshua, has sent my messenger to testify this to you about the communities. I am the scion and the seed of David. The shining star of the morning. Close quote, the text of the witness resumes. The breath and the bride say together, come. Let the hearers say, come. Let the thirsty come. Let the volunteer take the water of life freely. I myself testify to every hearer of the words of the inspiration of this volume. If anyone adds to them, Elohim will add to him the afflictions described in this volume. If anyone takes away from the words of the volume of this inspiration, Elohim will take away his share of the tree of life outside the city of the sanctuary described in this volume. The witness to these things says, "Yes, I come quickly, Amen. Come, Adon Yeshua." Dilection of the Adon Yeshua to all. The event of this come, and here comes temporality, I would say, precedes and calls the event. It would be that starting from which there is any event. You see here, it's needed for any event to be real. It's not an obstacle, it is a necessity. The coming, the to come of the event that cannot be thought under the given category of event. Come appeared to me to appeal to the place, but here the word place becomes too enigmatic. Let us say to the place, the time, and to the advent of what in the apocalyptic in general no longer lets itself be contained simply by philosophy, metaphysics, onto eschato theology, and by all the readings they have proposed of the apocalyptic. Here Derrida interchanges place with time, and think it's a sort of maneuver, a trope here that would be helpful. I cannot reconstitute what I have attempted in this respect in a milieu of resonances, responses, citations referring to texts of Blanchot, Levinas, Heidegger, and others such as one could hazard to do today with the latest book of Marguerite Duras, L'homme assis dans le couloir. What I had then tried to expose to analysis, that would be, among other things, a spectrography of tone and of change of tone. By definition could not keep itself at the disposal of or confine itself to the measure of philosophical, pedagogical, or teaching demonstration. First, because come, opening the scene, could not become an object, a theme, a representation, or even a citation in the current sense, and subsumable under a category, whether that of coming or event. So here he's pointing to come cannot be subsumable or put into a category. It's the very becoming itself, presencing as Heidegger calls it. For the same reason that bends itself difficultly to the rhetoric required by the present scene. Nonetheless, I am trying to extract from this, at the risk of essentially deforming it, the demonstrative function in terms of philosophical discourse. Moving more hastily, I shall say than the following. Come from the other already as a response and a citation without present past, without past present. Come tolerates no metalinguistic citation. My commentary cannot be transferred into something transcendental or beyond, even when it is itself a narrative, a récit, already, a recitative and a song whose singularity remains at once absolute and absolutely divisible. Calm no more lets itself be arraigned by an ontotheoeschatology than by a logic of the event, however new they may be and whatever politics they announce. In this affirmative tone, calm marks itself in oneself, neither a desire nor an order, neither a prayer nor a request. More precisely, the grammatical, linguistic, or semantic categories from which the come will thus be determined are traversed by the come. This come, I do not know what it is, not because I yield to obscurantism, that's great of Derrida, but because the question, what is, belongs to a space, and from it the knowledge of grammar, linguistics, semantics, and so on. The stalemate space, I would call it. Opened by a come from the other. Between all the comes, the difference is not grammatical, linguistic, semantic or pragmatic, and thus permitting us to say it's an imperative, it's a jussive modality, it's a must, I would say. It's a performative of such and such a type, and so on. And the difference is tonal, very important here. Once more he's pointing to the tone as telling. It is tonal. And I do not know whether a tonal difference finally lends itself to all these questions. Try to say come. It can be said in every tone. Come, come, come. And you'll see, you'll hear. The other will hear first, perhaps, or not. It is the gesture in speaking, parole, that gesture which does not let itself be recovered by the analysis, linguistic, semantic, or rhetorical of speaking. It cannot be caged. It cannot be put in a transcendental beyond, because it is a come. It's not a going away. Come, beyond being. This comes from beyond being and cause beyond being. Engaging perhaps in the place where ereignis and enteignis unfold the movement of appropriation. This is very close to the enfoldment of implicit and explicit in David F. Peat. How they unfold into each other, neither being the static one, but in the very unfoldment, the temporal happening between implicit and explicit. That's where it is. So it's not one or the other, it's not both together. It is something of a fifth possibility. And that possibility, I would say, is temporality, time. If come does not try to lead, if it no doubt is anagogic, it can always be led back higher than itself, anagogically, toward conductive violence, toward authoritarian duction, like in seduction or induction or deduction. This risk is ineluctable. It threatens the tone as its double. And even in the confession of seduction, in saying in a certain tone, I am in the act of seducing you, I do not suspend, I can even increase the seductive power. Perhaps Heidegger would not have liked this apparently personal conjugation or declension of coming. But they are not personal, subjective, or ego-logical. Come cannot come from a voice, or least from a tone signifying I or self. Fantastic, this is very good. And so, male and female. We're now referring to the subjective. And come cannot come from a voice, or at least from a tone signifying I or self. And this is the origo, I would say, you get from the detoned reality of X, Y, Z. It doesn't come from a self. To be compared to the autobiography, the voice of the friend, if you make it the voice of the friend, it will stop to be telling. It will be less. It would be circumcised in a diminishing manner. Stopped. Soulless. You can also compare the self to the origo in the coordinate system. And to make that unmovable, making it transcendental will be a lockdown on thinking and understanding, making it not penetratable, or the interpenetration. The subject can no longer move. And very good, calm does not address itself to an identity determinable in advance. It's not an a priori, as we meant before. This tendency of Kant, which so infuses all our thinking today, that we in advance tell reality or the coming what it is. Calm does not address itself to an identity determinable in advance. It is a drift, underivable from the identity of a determination. Calm is only derivable, absolutely derivable, but only from the other, from nothing that may be an origin or a verifiable, decidable, presentable, appropriable identity, from nothing not already derivable and arrivable, without riv. As I mentioned before, we fear this temporality for no good reason, and here it comes in the text of Derrida. Perhaps you would be tempted to call this disaster, catastrophe, apocalypse. Now here, precisely is announced, as promise or threat, an apocalypse without apocalypse. An apocalypse without vision, without truth, without revelation. Dispatches, addresses without message, and without destination, without sender and decidable addressee, without last judgment, without any other eschatology than the tone of the come. It is very different, an apocalypse beyond good and evil. Come does not announce this or that apocalypse. Already it resounds with a certain tone. It is itself the apocalypse, all the apocalypse. Come is apocalyptic. Just here, Derrida is going to this fear, the fear of taking away the omnipotence or omniscience of ourselves, stepping down for our self-proclaimed position of nowhere, and how we were to lose all that we thought that we gained by stepping down, living in the world of time and space, and no longer be able, like Einstein, to tell God his own doings and intentions. Who would like to step down from that? The position of telling God what he's thinking, or wanting, or deciding. That is very common today. And come is a positive apocalyptic tone from that, or going away from that. The difference is tonal. It is needed to be repeated again and again. It is all in the tone that temporality give the D-tone voice its life once more. Its ability to address something, to tell, and to start. And as it says on page 33, it can no longer itself be contained simply by philosophy, metaphysics, onto eschatotheology, and by all the readings they have proposed on the apocalyptic. It cannot be tamed, cannot be neutralized, enslaved. And a bit further down on page 34, come cannot come from a voice, or at least from a tone signifying I or self. So, in the same time in our megalomania or hybris is probably a good word, we also make ourselves into the oligo, the starting point of understanding, the point from nowhere. And thereby the damage we make to God, we also make to ourselves. In the same moment, simultaneously, by putting God out of existence, out of time and space, making him a thinking God, we also reduce ourselves or fixate ourselves to an I or a self. That's the terrorism of the self. An IRA or PLU of revenge that comes from our diminishing God. And although we think this I or self is so grand, it's not ourself. It is beyond. It has the beyondness, the transcendental, hypnagogic or mystagogic tendency. And when you try to touch it, your hand will go right through. No wonder Cartesius or Descartes had the utmost horrific saying that the soul didn't have extension. Therefore, it was not part of what is tangible and real. He made the soul to a nothing, calling it res cogitans. And he made equal damage to this world, calling it barely or merely res extensa. It's almost like the soul existed before Descartes, an exaggeration of course from my part, but I think this hyperbole is there to make a point that this has consequences, as you can see. And come is definitely apocalyptic. it tells you that temporality is there, that you can reach a closeness to yourself and God, doing it at the same time. Becoming temporal is becoming real. So, of course, Kant is the mystagogue, but also the ones he's attacking. And also, in a way, we are mystagogues, but the mystery is hidden within. Maybe there's a comment from you, Kalle?
Yes. Thank you. You remember perhaps that I pointed out at page 31 the words, he cries in a great voice, who is worthy? The who is worthy is written with larger font. This is a quotation from Revelation chapter 5. And then if we compare it with page 34, what you comment on, Hans, but these comes, the voices that we hear, they are not personal, subjective or ecological. Com cannot come from a voice, or least from a tone signifying I or self. A so and so, male or female, in my determination, my bestimmung, vocation to destination, myself. Is there not a contradiction here? So on one hand, we see that Derrida acknowledges that the voice has a tone. That is, for instance, he puts with a larger font, who is worthy, but here he says the opposite. Com can come from a voice, or at least from a tone signifying I or self. So this com, does it have a voice? It must come from a voice, I would say, because otherwise it would not have a tone. But on the other hand, I think that his point is that it's we, the readers, who must put the tone, because we only have the text, and we can only guess what the tone was. So we is the ear of the other, that is we who are putting the tone. It's always the, like in quantum physics, the observer who decides, who has the deciding point. Because the John, how can we know what he said? It's we who has to sign the meaning. So let me read this very slowly because it's very difficult. Perhaps Heidegger would not have liked this apparently personal communication or declension of coming, but they are not personal, subjective or ecological. Com can come from a voice, or at least from a tone signifying I or self, and so on, male or female, in my determination, my bestimmung, vocation, the destination, myself. Do you want to comment on this? Very difficult.
It's very difficult, and yes, it's not reducible to a self. It's a voice that speaks larger. It's the soul. This I can compare to the self, maybe a diminishing view of who we are and also of God. But the soul is bigger than this, outside of reality. It is that one that has a tone. It's maybe my proposition here, when there is a detonal voice, then you have this ego or self. But when it enters a tone to the voice, it vibrates. That is the soul speaking, the spirit. It comes from me, not from my I, or from the person that I am in this context. My determination, vocation to the destination, myself, the postman delivers. We often mention the postman here. And the telecable, which is not taught. It doesn't have the strength. This doesn't have the strength. It's a pure line. It's an I situated here, the I point. It doesn't have the capability to speak. It's larger than the single I. It's the spirit, it's the soul. And it speaks in a wondrous tone of voice. I have a personal memory here, if it's okay, I share it. I went to Mass many years in Corfu, and the whole Mass ended with the bishop in Kerkira town sang, and it had the tone of voice. I didn't understand any of the words, but it had this vibrato that touched all of us. It was no longer the ego speaking, it was the soul. It vibrated so you can feel the vibration even in the paper. Vibrated. Could be that that is the fractality of it all. So understanding is temporal, not a reduction of something that even when I say this, it feels like I'm saying something sarcastic like Derrida. I feel it cannot be that way. Blocking temporality means stopping understanding, the greater thing. In the logic, it doesn't look that way. I agree. We feel that a temporal understanding will block eternity and the extents of the whole world. No, the apocalyptic tone reveals and opens up. It makes what is reduced greater, although we ourselves choose this. At some instance, I think that we choose this. We were tricked to that by our own mystagogue. Maybe a last comment. Well, I think time is up. Thank you for participating in this most difficult text. Thank you, Kalle, for your comments. And we will repeat this, maybe the most complicated part of the whole article later on. Have a very pleasant afternoon, and bye-bye for now.
Thank you.